Okay, everyone, thank you so much for joining. So glad to have you here. It's so wonderful to be part of this Legacy Summer Summit. My name's Pete Davis. I am the director of the Democracy Policy Network. We're an organization that raises up ideas for deepening democracy. And to start out from dream to reality, the policy change cycle, I'd like to begin with a story that's going to talk a bit about the stakes and the hopes of what we're talking about today. It starts at what I believe is one of the most important dates in American history, New Year's 1863 at midnight. It was the night when the Emancipation Proclamation would take effect. This was a monumental moment, the formal culmination of a centuries-long struggle in America against American slavery. And to celebrate, thousands of abolitionists had gathered in Boston's Music Hall. The poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Ralph Waldo Emerson helped organize the event. And 20 years before, Longfellow had published poems on slavery to help support the abolitionist cause. And had spent the following 2 decades sponsoring abolitionist events and organizations, funding enslaved people seeking freedom, and working to support Senator Charles Sumner's legislative efforts to end slavery. Emerson himself had started lecturing against slavery 19 years before this moment. He used the magazine he had co-founded, which is still around, called The Atlantic, to advance the cause, and even welcomed abolitionist militant John Brown into his home. That night, when the crowd noticed Harriet Beecher Stowe in the gallery at the Boston Music Hall, they started waving their handkerchiefs and chanting, "Mrs. Stowe, Mrs. Stowe, Mrs. Stowe." And with her face, and this is a report at the time, all aglow with pleasure and excitement, Stowe moved toward the rail, bowed, and wiped tears away from her eyes as the crowd erupted in cheers for her. A decade or so earlier, after she had lost her 18-month-old son to cholera, Stowe had written Uncle Tom's Cabin, which would become one of the most influential texts of the abolitionist cause. In the hall that night was William Lloyd Garrison. He was an abolitionist newspaper man. He was in the gallery. 32 years before that night, you're starting to notice a pattern. They're all there in the gallery, and they started many years before. 32 years before that night, Garrison had launched The Liberator. It was a weekly paper that served as a community bulletin board for the abolitionist movement. His first issue of The Liberator stated his mission loud and clear. Here's the quote. Opening lines of The Liberator, 32 years in circulation. "I will not equivocate, I will not excuse, I will not retreat a single inch on abolition, and I will be heard." And he was heard. By the 1860s, you could find The Liberator in state houses, governor's mansions, congressional offices, and eventually the White House. But in the Boston Music Hall that day, celebration was in the air. Emerson read a poem. They had a full choir sing Mendelssohn's Hymn of Praise and Handel's Hallelujah Chorus. Down the block at the Tremont Temple Baptist Church, William Cooper Nell presided over a whole nother celebration for that night. He started the night off with, "From the Atlantic to the Pacific, there shall not be found a tyrant to wield the lash, nor slave to wear the chain." 4 decades before, William Cooper Nell, his father, had founded the Massachusetts General Colored Association, an abolitionist organization. 2 decades later, Nell founded his own organization, the New England Freedom Association, to aid refugee slaves and resist the Fugitive Slave Act. The Reverend Charles Bennett Ray was there too. He had become involved in the cause 30 years earlier as a promoter of the Underground Railroad and an editor of another abolitionist newspaper, the Colored American. Final speaker of the night, Frederick Douglass himself. 24 years earlier, he had escaped from slavery. In the subsequent decades, he had become a world-renowned preacher. He started his own newspaper, the North Star. He was an author of best-selling memoir. He lobbied President Lincoln in his speech that night, punctuated by jubilant shouts of "Amen" and "Bless the Lord." He said that the nation's period of darkness had come into a dawn of light. People ran back and forth from the telegraph office that night in 1863 to get word if the Emancipation Proclamation had indeed been issued. It was 8 o'clock, and then it was 9 o'clock, and then it was 10 o'clock. Douglass reported later in his memoir, still no word. Some had worried Abraham Lincoln had gone back on his promise. But then someone ran in, shouting, it's the equivalent of a New York Times push notification today. "It is coming. It is on the wires." not long after it was read aloud to both crowds at these two buildings, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves henceforth shall be free. And Douglass wrote in his memoir, there was a wild and grand scene. People threw hats and bonnets in the air. Old nemesis from the movement had hugged. Douglass's friend began singing his favorite hymn, Sound the Loud Timbrel o'er Egypt's dark sea. Jehovah hath triumphed, his people are free. When they were kicked out of the hall at midnight, the crowd walked to another church known as the Fugitive Slave Church, 12th Street Baptist Church. They celebrated until dawn. These abolitionists' decades of work had paid off. They had won a victory for humanity. And I tell this story to start us off because we often hear that it is what it is, that nothing ever changes and there's nothing we can do about anything. And this is such a great example of how much that is wrong. What happened in Boston on New Year's 1863 shows that when you commit to something, when you push at it over the course of many years, when you give your varied talents to it, when you fight off the distraction, uncertainty, and exhaustion that threaten your will to keep going, you sometimes win. And there's no reason not to think that if we too dedicate ourselves to the callings of our time, if we work to become long-haul heroes as well, similar celebrations of long-hoped-for triumph await us as well. And so what I want to talk about today is how you turn dreams over many decades into reality in politics, what could be called the policy change cycle. And the reason I started with this story is because it shows the joys at the end of the policy change cycle, but it also shows the work you need to get there. I think people don't know about the full extent of the policy change cycle because the stories we tell are usually only at the end of the cycle. When Hollywood tells tales of courage, they usually take the form of slaying the dragon. There's a bad guy in a big moment where a brave knight makes a definitive decision to risk everything to win some victory for the people. It's the idea that political heroism is standing in front of the tank, or troops storming up the hill, or a candidate giving the perfect speech at the perfect time, or the grand march where everyone's marching. But this is not the most important type of heroism for us to model in the world of policy change, because most of us don't have to face many dramatic, decisive moments, at least not ones that spring out of nowhere. Most of us in political life just confront daily life. Normal morning after normal morning where we can decide to start working on something or keep working at something or not. That's what politics tends to give us, not big brave moments, but a stream of little ordinary ones out of which we must make our own causes, our own meaning. The real heroes of policy change through day in, day out, year in, year out work become the dramatic events themselves together. The dragons that stand in their way are not these clear dragons. It's the everyday boredom and distraction and uncertainty that threaten sustained commitment. And their big moments look a lot less like sword waving and a lot more like the slow work of gardening. Political change is the long and hard spade work of having an idea emerge, then gain traction, then be part of a big fight, then eventually become law. And I want to get into the nitty-gritty of that today, of how that actually happens. So what I want to talk about today is, how do ideas emerge? How do they gain popularity? How do you build coalitions around them? How do they become law? Because knowing where you are in this cycle over the years of how change happens can clarify what you need to do next. And on the other side, if you're doing something in policy change and it isn't working, perhaps it's because you haven't done a previous step in the cycle yet. So I have 10 steps here, organized mostly into 3 groups: raising up a problem, raising up a solution, pushing a solution into law. So let's get started walking through these steps and how these steps work. So the first step, community formation. And this is a very ignored step often. It's that you need to have a community to have a cause. The community is the medium through which causes flow. If people don't see themselves as part of something larger than themselves, if they are all isolated, you start talking about public problems and public solutions and public ideas and public causes, and you just get blank stares because there is no shared language through which to even conceive of these things. So before you even start hitting the drumbeat of a cause, you often have to get people together to see themselves as part of a community. Today, we are very isolated. So when you talk about problems, people process them privately. A problem is something that affects me alone and of which it's my job to solve alone or find some app that will solve it for me. So you need to create a public first before you have a public cause. And you can see these examples throughout history. I put on the slide 3 different flags. Let's start with the gay pride flag. In 1924 was in Chicago, Henry Gerber launched the first gay rights organization. It was called the Society for Human Rights. In the first gay rights organization in America. And if you read the mission statement of that organization, it was 7 people meeting in his apartment in Chicago. The house is now a historic landmark if you want to go see it, the Gerber House. The words they use to describe what they're doing are almost indiscernible to us today because they didn't even have the words to describe who they were and what they were trying to do. They were grasping at words that were existing back then to describe who they were and what they were doing. Often it was in reaction to what people were doing to them. Like, we are all the words are very psychologized. It's like, we're all here because we've been told that we have some problem, and it seems like we might have something in common because we've all been told we have this problem, and why don't we come together to advocate for ourselves? And then over the course of the next decades, a culture started building around this community of people. That culture eventually created a flag, and they saw themselves as a public that would even have an advocacy group that would be distinct from the rest of the public. And that flag came up. Another one is the Black Liberation flag I have here. It was created by Marcus Garvey, who founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And there has always been a Black identity in America, but what he tried to do is he's trying to found a Pan-African identity all around the world and assign a flag to that and say this is a group of people that should see themselves, whether you're in Jamaica or you're in Africa or you're an African immigrant to Britain or to America or wherever, you should see yourself as part of a shared public. And culture building things like having a flag is part of that. This is the Join or Die flag at the bottom left, which is Ben Franklin's attempt to say that people in America should see themselves as distinct from Britain and also see themselves not as a collection of state citizens, but as a collection of national citizens that should come together to fight for causes that are relevant only to these citizens. And that cultural work of becoming a public was the first step before they even had the cause of the revolution. And these are all grand examples in history, but even when you get a block, I have that fourth picture of a neighborhood association, even just getting a neighborhood association together and saying, we are all in the shared neighborhood, we have shared problems and shared visions of what we could be. It doesn't have to be a big thing. Getting people to see themselves as part of a shared thing, even before you have a cause, is the first step. So that's community formation. Next up, we have public problem identification. So once you have a community, you can start getting together and you can start identifying problems that are public and shared among that community. You weave together private problems into public problems. So probably the most famous case of this in American history is the consciousness raising circles of second wave feminism. So in the 60s and 70s, radical women, radical feminists would get together and they would encourage people to get together. The way to promote second wave feminism was get together in these things called consciousness raising circles. And what they would do is they'd get together and they'd simply start talking about their private problems that arose from being a woman. And out of these conversations came public problems. So someone in a consciousness raising circle would say, my husband hits me and I don't like it. And they would all say, oh, my husband hits me too and I don't like it. My husband doesn't do any work around the house, yet he gets all the credit. And if my husband dies or my husband leaves me, um, uh, I'm left all alone without any way to make it. I tried to do work, but I can't advance at work because everyone's always coming on to me. And so you have these things in the language of the time. And then out of those discussions, new words emerge for these public problems. You start saying, well, why don't we call that domestic violence? Why don't we call that wages for housework, the labor, family labor? Why don't we call that thing at work sexual harassment? So this word sexual harassment, very normal word in American life today. Someone invented that word called sexual harassment because it used to be 10,000 examples of something that we never had a word for. And then someone said, wait, this is harassment and it's sexual harassment. And now we have a word that out of those private problems became a public problem that we can address through law or through cultural fights or through power moving. And you see modern versions of this in third wave feminism emerging out of the communities online. So you have things like the Bechdel test, which is the fact, this discovery of a way to test if movies are objectifying women. You have mansplaining, you have manspreading, you have rape culture, all these words that arise out of people being in community, being networked together, seeing themselves as the shared public, and then taking their private problems and weaving them together into public problems and naming them. And often those are like really out in the public cultural examples. There's also often these are identified by people in the shadows and the margins, getting the word out about their problems and breaking through to the public. So, this right picture, that's a solitary confinement cell. The discovery of the harms of solitary confinement or the cruelties of our carceral system or the chaos of evictions or border detention centers, it was through people telling their own stories and other people reaching out to people along the margins to help raise up their stories to identify a collection of private problems that are in fact a public problem that arise. And other times it's not even just weaving together stories, it's connecting the dots. So you've probably all heard this phrase school to prison pipeline, or you've heard the phrase revolving door in Washington. These words did not appear out of nowhere. They arose with someone identifying a public problem and connecting the dots and saying, wait, why is everyone who's working for the federal government becoming a lobbyist and then working for the federal government, and then slowly the federal government is becoming corrupt? Let's call that the revolving door. Or why is it that the kids that are being suspended from school are later being arrested and they're getting track records from being suspended from school? Let's call that the school to prison pipeline. That is public problem identification. So when you have a community and you start weaving private problems together, start connecting the dots, you have public problem identification. Then the next step's public problem elaboration. So you might have the word, but then some people might not believe you, or it wasn't compelling to them, or it started in your radical vanguard group of people that only make up 2% of the country, and you need to spread the word out and get more information out there. Your next step is public problem elaboration. So you need to flesh out this idea. You need to find proof. You need to elaborate. So the most influential book of the last 25 years, it launched basically an entire, revival of a movement, was New Jim Crow, which was Michelle Alexander, a little-known law professor in Ohio, deciding to connect the dots and have incredible collection of data and narrative and historical pattern matching that came together into this powerful story for prison reform. Same with Matthew Desmond's Evicted, which is currently in the process of raising up this idea of popularizing the idea of our housing crisis. A famous one in history is The Red Record. Ida B. Wells spent decades saying, okay, I've heard that there's a lynching problem. In our community, we know there's a lynching problem, but we need to convince a majority of this country to deal with this lynching problem. And she wrote one of the first kind of infographic-filled documents, The Red Record, after studying the lynching problem. And sometimes it's not just gathering data, it's just gathering emotional resonance. This is what Uncle Tom's Cabin was a book that put a public problem that had been identified by the Vanguard group into a narrative that could reach everyone. Same goes with Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. A lot of vanguard climate change activists knew about climate change, but it hadn't broken through the popular consciousness. He figured out a way to do that with a documentary. Then the fourth step, and this is the final step of raising up a public problem, is you got a coalition build around a problem. By which you mean you have to get a substantial amount of people to see that the problem is a problem for them. And you can, for some people, they might see themselves in this problem because of their ideals, like you pull on their moral heartstrings. For other people, they see themselves in this problem because of their interests. You show them that this problem might look like it's only affecting this small group of people, but it's actually affecting everyone. And let me give you 3 examples of that. One far in history is the free soil idea in the Republican Party in the 1860s. When the Republican Party first emerged in the 1860s, when it was very different than it is today, it was this idea. It was built around this idea of the free soil ideology. And what they said was, when you have a slave power in the South, it's not only hurting the enslaved workers themselves, it's also hurting white free laborers who are competing against these plantations. And it's also hurting rich northern industrialists in Boston who are trying to build corporations, but they're facing off against these kind of fascist feudalist slave powers down south. So why don't we get these northern industrialists and these white free laborers who are never going to own a plantation like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson did, and enslaved workers themselves with their supporters like abolitionists, other abolitionists, together under a free labor ideology that can all together see the slave power as their enemy. Another example is in the free trade movement, when Lori Wallach and the folks at Public Citizens Global Trade Watch wanted to fight corporate-driven, quote-unquote, free trade pushes and fight instead for fair trade. They had to weave together international coalitions of all the people that were hurt by these so-called corporate-driven free trade deals, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership or something like that. And so they got farmers together, and they got unions together, and they got environmentalists together, because when you have, it might hurt the environment. And then you got the sweatshop worker rights groups in international places, and to all see themselves as saying this non-fair trade deals are all part of their shared problem. One final example is this wonderful organization called Demos has this race class narrative project, which is trying to weave together people who care about class struggle with people who care about anti-racism by showing how they're intimately connected. And trying to weave this narrative, a true narrative, which is that many people who want to keep America unequal economically will use racism to divide people and thus keep the economic structure the same. So if you care about having a more equal economy, you should care about having a more equal, you should care about fighting racial hierarchy and injustice as well. And that's an attempt to do coalition building around a shared problem. So that is kind of, once you got to this place, you're doing good. This is very hard. This might take a decade to get to this. But then you have this group of people. They have become a community. They have identified a problem. They fleshed it out. They have a bunch of people that support you in this public problem. Then you actually need solutions, because it's like, what are we going to do about it? What should we? What must be done? And then out of that, ideas pop up. So you need to let these solutions emerge, and you need to foster these little seedlings of ideas. And the best way to have solutions emerge is to look for precedents. Look into history to see if there's a solution to the problem that you all share. Look to other countries to see how they deal with that problem. Look to other sectors, like maybe this is a problem in health, but how do they deal with it in the law? Or maybe this is a problem in this type of hiring, but maybe in another type of hiring they do it. Or is this a problem that architects have solved with regard to architecture, but we could bring it to the accounting industry, or whatever place you want to mine for examples. Out of that, solutions arise. And the big challenge with solutions is you got to name them and you got to write them up. One of my favorite philosophers, Roberto Hunger, says, before we convince others, we must convince ourselves. And so often you think that's the easy part, but a lot of public solution identification is, hey, can you articulate what this alternative that you want is? Can you name it? with a kind of snappy name, and can you explain it, and explain give answers to the first 5 questions that emerge about it. So, you know, and you know, universal basic income, that was a name for an idea about giving people money. Medicare for all, it could have been called something else. It could have been called a national health system, or it could have been called, and you have to figure out what the name is. The Breathe Act is this really interesting idea arising federally and around the states around responding to police violence and racial injustice in our carceral system. And they've put together a bunch of different micro ideas into this macro idea called the Breathe Act. And that process of putting them together and naming it is work itself. It doesn't emerge out of nowhere. So, and then you need public solution elaboration next. You got a snappy idea, people like it on the surface, but then they start asking questions. And there's a lot of parts of public solution elaboration. You need to get academic buy-in often. That'll convince people to get excited. So this is a article in Lancet, a very prominent, health academic journal, advocating for the numbers on if we did Medicare for all, how many lives would it save? Sometimes it's applying the solution to specific contexts. So the one in the middle right here is how many tax dollars would be saved in Tennessee if Medicaid was expanded. I'm just using one example. Often the elaboration work is going to someone and saying, oh, you're from Iowa, here's how my idea will help Iowa specifically. It's often a lot of graphs and charts, but oftentimes it's prefiguring the idea. Can we get a pilot program somewhere? And once we get a pilot program, can we study that pilot program? And then you need a coalition build around a solution, just like how you coalition build around a problem. And you're thinking probably, oh, well, isn't it the same coalition as the problem? But no, because sometimes a solution is not only solving your problem, it's also solving other problems, because solutions are, ideas are multifaceted. And so you actually can build a bigger coalition, because oftentimes big ideas, even small ideas, solve multiple things at once. So you got to go out and find who can see themselves in this solution. So I gave some examples of really good coalition building around a solution. The Green New Deal for public schools is a branch of the Green New Deal movement, and it's a way to merge people who care about climate change with people who care about the building trades, people who are building, it's about building green schools, basically. People who care about building public buildings, so everyone who's a construction worker can buy into this, with teachers who care about their students having better ventilated, more sustainable buildings that they're in. Suddenly you have these 3 groups that all see themselves in the solution. This over here on the right is Sister Simone Campbell from Nuns on the Bus. It was a clever way to get this moral leader supporting the Affordable Care Act, and that can bring along a people that might look to that moral leader, like nuns, into this cause. And often, just getting the word out about your solution with actions, dramatizing the solution, challenging people to say, what side are you on of this solution, is part of this too. So that's raising up the problem and then raising up the solution. We're coming to the home stretch here. Next up is securing a beachhead. So once you have a coalition around the problem, a solution emerges, coalition around the solution. Next up, and this might happen earlier, but this is the next step you have to do. You got to secure a beachhead in power, by which you have to find people on the inside that are going to start working the inside of power for your cause. And so here are 3 examples of beachheads. Michelle Wu, who's now mayor of Boston, when she was a city councilwoman, she was one of the great bike advocates in Boston. So the biking community that wanted more bike lanes, they had their ally. She was their beachhead on the city council who would start advocating internally for you, speaking the language of power. Green New Deal, famously has AOC and Senator Ed Markey as their beachhead of advocating for this in Congress. And then John Quincy Adams was one of the first abolitionists in Congress. After he was done being president, he ran for Congress again to advocate, to make sure there was a voice of abolition in Congress, and started the process of chipping away at the ice in Congress around that cause. And these beachheads are very important. And if you have a beachhead person who's your ally on the inside, you really have to protect them and have your movement kind of help, take care of your beachhead and they'll take care of you. Then once you have that beachhead and the ideas kind of in power, starting to be advocated for in power, then comes the long process of hand-to-hand combat. By which I mean hand-to-hand combat is it's a bunch of little micro activist, challenges, side quests of sorts that whip the votes basically, or whip the levers of power that are needed to get your thing over the finish line to become law. And so sometimes that means just writing and advocating in a normal way. Sometimes that means confronting, showing up at a town hall meeting and saying, we need you to, what side are you on, congressperson? What side are you on, council member? What side are you on, board of directors of this corporation? Sometimes that means if the confrontations aren't working and the writing isn't working, it means voting them out and going through multiple election cycles where you primary or challenge in a general election folks to come to your side. Sometimes that means when people are running, you get pledges from them that if they are elected, they will support your cause, and we're going to withhold our votes if you don't do that. And then over time, it's this long process of whipping votes until you have a majority in whatever body you're advocating for. And then finally, if you get the law passed, or the project implemented, or the policy change happened, you have to keep your coalition together and watchdog. Here's a little devil is in the details on the slide here. And what's really important about this is that, the power structures are going to determine the structure of the implementation of the policy you care about. So if you dissolve after you pass the law and don't keep advocating and watchdogging, whatever other power structures will determine what how the thing is eventually shaped. The politics usually doesn't stop at the passage. There's bureaucratic politics, there's institutional politics, there's getting the word out to the people that the new policy is their politics, and it's all very important. For example, classic example is it was a law on the books since 1866 or 7 that every man in America could vote, but very clearly it took 100 years of watchdogging implementation to make sure that that amendment became a reality. And so everything, devil is in the details. It's almost, you need causes just to have your implementation work. So that is the policy change cycle. This is all very hard, but it's worth it. And over time, it works. The deeper, juster democracy we seek is already present today in piecemeal, in various projects and initiatives scattered throughout the country at various stages along the cycle. And our job is to do our part to push our corner forward. And this is not a small thing, to push our little corner of this policy cycle on our little cause forward. It's everything. This is what the great Catholic worker advocate Dorothy Day meant when she said, we fight futility when we make peace with laying one brick at a time, taking one step at a time. It's what the Kentucky philosopher poet Wendell Berry meant when he wrote in this beautiful poem entitled February 2nd, 1968, that quote, in the dark of the moon, in flying snow, in the dead of winter, war spreading, families dying, the world in danger. The best thing we can do is walk the rocky hillside sowing clover. That's what we have to do. It seems like a rocky hillside right now in 2022 America, but we have to sow clover over the long haul. So let's get to work. Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful group to talk with you. And I wanted to leave time at the end for questions, comments, pushback, ideas, vigorous disagreement, questions for clarification, other examples in your life that you've seen, questions this arises. Let's talk.